There is a moment, a single suspended second, where every man on a battlefield makes a choice. Not with his hands, not with his weapon, with something older than training, older than fear, older than the uniform on his back. Most men never find out what lives inside that moment. Marcus Luttrell found out in the mountains of Afghanistan. Chris Kyle found out behind a scope in Ramadi. But this story belongs to a man whose name most people will never see on a book cover or a movie poster. A man who, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, in a situation that had nothing to do with any war, stood in a parking lot with 4 German shepherds screaming toward him at 40 miles an hour, and made a choice that nobody in that crowd of 200 people could have predicted. Not the officers who gave the order, not the trainers who held the leashes, not the dog handlers who released them. Because when you train a man for years to walk into the mouth of everything the world has that is terrible, when you strip him down to bone and rebuild him into something that does not flinch, you create something that surprises even itself. This is what happened. This is what he did. And this is why, 15 years later, the officer who gave that order still does not talk about it. His name was Jason Cole, and he had survived things that would make most people's nightmares feel like a warm afternoon nap. He had been underwater for so long on a combat dive that when he finally surfaced, his hands had forgotten what air felt like. He had spent 48 hours in a desert observation post where the temperature hit 118 degrees, and the only thing he drank was what he sweated out and collected in the lining of his jacket. He had been shot at from 3 directions simultaneously in a narrow alley in Mosul, and had come out of it with nothing but a torn shoulder and a story he told exactly once to no one. By the time Jason Cole came back stateside, he had been deployed 4 times. He had been a Navy SEAL for 11 years. He carried his service the way some men carry old injuries, silently, without complaint, and with a slight tightening around the eyes when someone asked about it at a dinner party. He was 34 years old. He was done with war. He had taken a job as a civilian contractor for a private security firm based out of Virginia Beach, and most of his work now involved assessment, evaluating security protocols for corporate clients, government buildings, and the kind of wealthy private estates that had their own zip codes. It was clean work, organized, predictable in all the ways that combat never was. He liked predictable. He had earned predictable. The event at Forsyth County Law Enforcement Training Center on the afternoon of March 14th started, as most disasters do, with a very reasonable plan. The facility was running what they called an enhanced response demonstration, a public showcase of their K-9 unit capabilities designed for a crowd of local government officials, police department representatives, and invited press. The idea was straightforward. Demonstrate the effectiveness of trained police dogs in suspect apprehension scenarios. Show the crowd what the unit could do. Justify the budget. Get the applause. Go home. Jason was there because his firm had been hired to assess the security infrastructure of the facility itself. The fencing, the camera coverage, the crowd management protocols. He was not supposed to be anywhere near the demonstration field. He was supposed to be in a utility corridor on the east side of the building with a clipboard and a radio. He finished his corridor assessment 12 minutes early. This was the first link in the chain. He stepped outside to make a call to his project supervisor, found the cell signal better near the demonstration field, and drifted the way people drift when something loud and interesting is happening nearby toward the crowd that had gathered along the chain link barrier on the field's north side. There were maybe 200 people there. Local politicians in sport coats. Police brass with their arms crossed. A few journalists with cameras. Families of officers, kids pressed against the fence, wide-eyed and bouncing. The demonstration had already begun. On the field, a trainer in a padded bite suit was running a zigzag pattern while a single German shepherd tracked him from 40 yards out. When a handler dropped the lead, the dog covered the distance in 4 seconds. The crowd made the sound crowds make when something fast and precise happens in front of them. A collective exhale, part awe, part instinctive relief that they were on the correct side of the fence. Jason watched this with the professional disinterest of a man who had seen more lethal things move faster. What he was actually doing, because old habits are not retired, they're just resting, was clocking the facility's weak points. The north gate latch was the kind that could be popped from outside with a straightened coat hanger. The camera above the east entrance had a 12-degree blind spot that covered the entire gate mechanism. The crowd barrier along the north side was a single chain-link panel anchored by two posts, neither of which appeared to be bolted into anything more permanent than packed dirt. He made mental notes. He would put it in his report. Then, the second demonstration began. This one was different. The facility's head trainer, a compact, square-jawed man named Lieutenant Drew Harmon, stepped to the center of the field with a microphone and addressed the crowd with the particular combination of authority and showmanship that men in his position cultivate over years. He explained that what they were about to see was a multi-dog pursuit simulation. 4 dogs released simultaneously to demonstrate coordinated tracking and apprehension under high-stress conditions. The crowd murmured appreciatively. A few phones came up. The demonstration called for a volunteer from among the facility's own staff, someone already briefed, already padded up, someone who understood the protocol. That person was a training officer named Rodriguez who was, at this exact moment, supposed to be walking out of the facility's east door in full bite protection gear and taking his position at the far end of the field. Rodriguez was not walking out of the east door. Rodriguez was in the facility's medical room with a sprained ankle he had acquired 20 minutes earlier on a wet floor near the equipment storage room, being wrapped by the facility's on-site medic, and using language that the medic, a veteran himself, found genuinely impressive in its creativity. Lieutenant Harmon did not know this yet. His earpiece crackled. He kept his face pleasant for the crowd. He spoke quietly into his shoulder radio, asking for Rodriguez's status. The response he got was not the one he wanted. What followed was 40 seconds of backstage chaos that the crowd could not see, and Jason, standing at the fence, absolutely could, not because he heard anything, but because he was watching Harmon's left hand, which had gone from loose at his side to a fist wrapped around the microphone cord, and because 2 of the 4 dog handlers at the far end of the field had shifted their weight in the particular way that people shift when someone in their earpiece is telling them something has gone wrong. The third link in the chain. There was a junior training officer named Briggs, 26 years old, 8 months on the job. He had been standing near the east gate managing crowd flow and had been half listening to the radio chatter while also trying to remember if he had locked his car. When Harmon's voice came through asking for a field volunteer, staff only, anyone on the east perimeter, Briggs heard it as an opportunity. He was the kind of 26-year-old who heard most things as opportunities. He was not wearing a bite suit. He would realize this approximately 3 seconds after he raised his hand. By then, Harmon had already confirmed his position into the radio, and the crowd had already seen the junior officer step forward toward the field, and the demonstration, the 200-person, press-invited, budget-justifying demonstration, was already in motion in the specific way that rolling objects are in motion, which is to say that stopping it was going to be considerably harder than starting it had been. Briggs walked out onto the field. He was wearing his standard-issue uniform, dark pants, a department polo, his radio on his hip. He was moving with the kind of forced confidence that young men were when they have made a bad decision and decided that speed is the solution. Jason saw him come through the east gate. Jason saw the absence of protective gear. He did the math in approximately 1.5 seconds, which was roughly the amount of time it took for him to cover the distance from where he was standing to the gate latch that he had noted 40 minutes earlier could be popped from outside with a straightened coat hanger. He did not have a coat hanger. He had a pen. It was enough. The gate swung open. Behind him, someone in the crowd said, "Hey," and someone else said, "Sir, you can't," and Jason Cole was already on the field, moving not in a straight line toward Briggs, but at a diagonal, the kind of diagonal that puts a person between a threat and a target as efficiently as geometry allows. Harmon's voice came over the field speaker, sharp and flat. "Stand down." "Sir, stand down. You do not have authorization." Jason kept moving. Harmon, making the calculation that commanding officers make when they have lost control of a situation and need to demonstrate that they have not, made the call. Release the dogs. Later, people would debate this moment. Whether he expected the seal to run. Whether he thought the sight of 4 trained German shepherds at full sprint would produce compliance. Whether he had simply, in the pressure of the moment, made the worst possible red of the man standing on his field. The four handlers released the leads. The dogs came, 40 miles an hour, four of them, spread across the field like a thrown net, each one locked on the nearest moving human target, and the nearest moving human target was Jason Cole. He heard them before he fully turned. Not the sound of barking. Trained apprehension dogs don't waste breath barking when they're working. The sound he heard was the sound of paws on packed dirt for sets, the specific rhythm of animals at full extension, the sound that in a different context and a different hemisphere he had heard once before and never wanted to hear again. He turned to face them. He did not run. The crowd went completely silent. 200 people, phones half raised, breath held, watching a man in a contractor's polo shirt and no protective equipment stand and face four German shepherds coming at him at speed, and nobody in that crowd. Not the police brass, not the politicians, not the journalists with their cameras. Nobody said a single word because there are moments that override the human impulse to speak, and this was one of them. What Jason did next, they would be talking about for years. He dropped to one knee, arms out to the side, palms open, facing down, head lowered, completely still. The first dog reached him in 4 seconds. It slowed. The second and third followed the first lead. A trained pack responds to the behavior of the one that reaches the target first. And the first dog had encountered something that its training had not fully prepared it for. A human being who had made himself as non-threatening as a human being is physically capable of being, and who is doing it with such complete, unhurried stillness that the animal's apprehension drive had nothing to lock onto. The fourth dog circled him once and sat down. The first dog sniffed his outstretched hand. Jason Cole remained on one knee, perfectly still, in the middle of a law enforcement training field, surrounded by four German shepherds who had just gone from attack mode to confusion mode in the space of about 12 seconds, while 200 people stood in complete silence on the other side of a chain-link fence, and Lieutenant Drew Harmon held a microphone he had forgotten to bring to his mouth. The crowd did not applaud. Not yet. They were still processing what they had just seen, which was not a trick and not a performance and not the result of any special knowledge about dogs specifically. It was the result of something much simpler and much harder, which was a man who had at some point in his life learned to be so completely unafraid that even animals trained to sense fear had nothing to find. Briggs was standing 20 yards behind Jason, completely unharmed, holding very still in the specific way of a person who has recently understood exactly how close a thing was. Harmon finally brought the microphone up. He did not say anything. Jason slowly, without sudden movement, rose from his knee. He turned toward the east gate. He walked off the field. He did not look at Harmon. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at nothing except the gate he had come through, and he pushed it open with one hand, and he walked back to the fence line, and he picked up his clipboard from where he had set it against the post, and he stood there for a moment, looking at his notes about the gate latch. He added a line. Then he went back to work. The crowd found its voice about 15 seconds after he disappeared from the field, and what it found was not the polished, appreciative response that Lieutenant Harmon had been hoping to produce with his demonstration budget. It was something rawer than that, something that starts in the chest before it reaches the throat. The kind of sound that happens when 200 people simultaneously realize they have just witnessed something they will be trying to describe accurately for the rest of their lives. The video appeared on the internet at 6:47 the following morning. It was 11 seconds long. 11 seconds of shaky phone footage, slightly overexposed in the afternoon light, that showed a man in a dark polo shirt drop to one knee in the center of a field while four German shepherds converged on him at speed. And then nothing dramatic, no Hollywood moment, no visible command or gesture. The dog simply slowed, circled, and sat. 11 seconds. By noon it had 400,000 views. By the following morning, it had 11 million. By the end of the week, it had been shared by 3 major news outlets, 2 veteran advocacy organizations, a canine training association that posted it with a lengthy and slightly incorrect explanation of what had happened, and a retired Marine general who shared it without comment, which was from a retired Marine general, essentially the highest possible form of praise. Jason Cole did not see any of this immediately, because Jason Cole did not have social media accounts in the way that most people have social media accounts. He had a Facebook profile he had made in 2009 at the insistence of a woman he was seeing at the time, and had not logged into since approximately 2011, and an email address he checked every few days. He was not, by design, findable. He found out the video existed because his project supervisor called him at 7:30 in the morning, and the first words out of her mouth were not a greeting. They were, "Jason, what did you do?" This is how most things that matter get communicated. He was sitting at the small desk in his hotel room in Virginia Beach, drinking bad coffee and writing up his facility assessment report, which included, in clear professional language, a notation that the Northgate latch represented a Category 2 access vulnerability and should be addressed within 30 days. He had not yet decided whether to include a second notation about the fact that he himself had demonstrated this vulnerability by using a pin to open the gate during an active multi-dog demonstration, because he was still working out the phrasing. His supervisor sent him the link. He watched the 11 seconds. He watched it a second time. He put down his phone, finished his coffee, and went back to his report. His supervisor called again at 8. "Jason, there are reporters. There are always reporters somewhere. There are reporters calling our front desk asking for you specifically." A pause. "Tell them I'm in a meeting. You're in a hotel room writing an assessment report. Then tell them I'm in a very small meeting." He was not, by nature, a man who ran from things. Running was not the problem. The problem was something more specific and harder to articulate. He had spent 11 years in a world where the work was the point and the recognition was at best beside the point and at worst actively dangerous. He had known operators who got written up in magazine profiles and found that the profile had traveled ahead of them into the next deployment like a target drawn on a map. He had seen what happened to men who started to believe their own mythology while there were still real things required of them. The habits of that world do not fully depart when a uniform comes off. He was not, in any conscious sense, trying to avoid the attention. He simply did not understand what there was to pay attention to. He had seen Briggs walk onto a field without protective equipment. He had calculated the gap between the dog release order and the time it would take him to get between Briggs and the dogs. He had used a pin on a gate latch. He had knelt. He had been still. These were not, to him, extraordinary things. They were the application of specific knowledge to a specific problem, which is what training is for, which is what 11 years of doing very hard things in very high-stakes environments produces. Not courage as some separate quality that you either have or don't, but the granular, procedural knowledge of what to do with your body and your nervous system in the precise moment when most people's bodies and nervous systems are making decisions that override rational thought. He was not fearless. He had been afraid plenty of times. He was simply better than most people at recognizing the difference between situations where fear was useful information and situations where fear was noise. 4 trained German shepherds running at a stationary, kneeling, non-threatening human being were not going to attack that human being. Not because the dogs were gentle. Not because Jason was special. Because that was how the dogs had been trained. To apprehend movement, resistance, threat display. To track the signature of a fleeing, fighting, adrenaline-spiked target. Take all of that away, completely, physiologically, not as a performance, but as an actual neurological state, and the training has nothing to lock onto. The dogs slow. They investigate. They do what animals do when the expected stimulus doesn't appear. This was what Jason knew that the 200 people on the other side of the fence did not. It was not magic. It was information applied under pressure. But 11 million people had watched 11 seconds of it, and 11 million people had not seen information applied under pressure. They had seen a man face 4 attack dogs alone, and stand his ground, and win without raising his hand, and something about that image had landed in a place in the human chest that is not logical, and is not rational, but is very, very old. The place that knows the difference between a performance of courage and the real thing. That is what the video spread. Not the fact, the feeling. Lieutenant Drew Harmon issued a statement through the facility's public information officer on the second day. It was 3 paragraphs long and covered, in order, the facility's commitment to safety protocols, the circumstances of the demonstration that had led to an unplanned field interaction, and a note that the individual involved had not been authorized to enter the demonstration area. The statement did not mention what the individual had done once he entered the demonstration area. It did not mention Briggs. It did not mention the gate latch. It was the kind of statement that is written to close a story and instead opens 10 more questions. The press got Briggs's name from a department source who spoke anonymously on day 3. They got Briggs's phone number from a source who was slightly less anonymous on day 4. By day 5, Briggs had done 2 local television interviews in which he described, with the particular combination of sheepishness and excitement of a young man who has survived something by the thinnest possible margin, exactly what he had seen from 20 yards behind Jason Cole. "I thought he was going to get destroyed," Briggs said, sitting in a news studio chair that was slightly too big for him. "I'm not going to lie to you. I thought this man is about to be destroyed by 4 dogs on live camera, and it is completely my fault." He paused, and then he just knelt down, and they stopped. "And I've been in this job almost a year, and I have never seen anything like that. I have never seen a person be that." He searched for the word, the way young people search for words that their vocabulary hasn't fully built yet. "That's settled." That's the only word I can think of. Like nothing in him was running. Nothing in him was running. That clip ran on every major network. Harmon watched it from his office. He was a man who had built his career on the principle that authority is demonstrated through control, and on the afternoon of March 14th, he had issued an order that was supposed to demonstrate control and had instead demonstrated something that he was still not entirely sure how to categorize. He had watched a civilian walk onto his field, disregard his direct command, survive a 4-dog pursuit by kneeling quietly in the dirt, and walk away without a scratch and without a word, and the only person in the entire facility who had looked in that moment like they knew what they were doing was the person who should not have been there at all. This was not a comfortable thing to sit with. He made some calls. He found out about the contractor role. He found out about the SEAL background. He found out about 11 years and for deployments and a service record that, even in the redacted version that was available through proper channels, contained enough to explain most of what he had seen on that field. He did not, ultimately, file a report against Jason for the unauthorized field entry. His reasoning was private, and he did not share it with anyone. But people who know him say that around this time, he started asking different questions when he evaluated his own training protocols. Started asking not just whether his officers could follow procedure under pressure, but whether they had ever, in any context, in any part of their lives, learned what it felt like to be genuinely settled inside a moment that was trying very hard to knock them over. He did not have a good answer. Most people don't. The veteran community found the video through a different channel. It reached them not through news outlets, but through the informal networks, the group chats, the forums, the private Facebook groups that exist outside the public-facing version of military culture. And in those spaces, the response was different from what was happening on the mainstream internet. On the mainstream internet, people were calling Jason Cole a hero. In the veteran networks, they were calling him something else. Not better or worse. More specific. Theirs. There's a thing that happens when you have been through selection and training and deployment and come back from it, which is that you develop a particular sensitivity to the difference between a person performing steadiness and a person who actually has it. You have been around enough people under enough pressure to know what the real thing looks like, because you have seen the fake thing fail in places where failure has consequences that don't make the internet. And when the video moved through those networks, what the people in them responded to was not the dramatic image of a man versus 4 dogs. It was the walk off the field, the clipboard, the report, the fact that he had gone back to work. That is a very specific kind of person. That is a person who does not need the moment to mean something grand, who does the thing and then goes back to the thing before the thing. A former SEAL Master Chief named Torres, who had been out for 6 years and was running a contracting firm in San Diego, posted a single sentence in one of the larger veteran forums. He wrote, "I know that walk." For words. It got 3,000 responses in 24 hours. Every one of them from someone who knew exactly what he meant. Meanwhile, Jason Cole finished his assessment report, submitted it to his supervisor, and drove back to his apartment in Virginia Beach, where he had a dog of his own. A 6-year-old rescue mutt of indeterminate heritage named Burke, who greeted him with the specific variety of joy that dogs produce when the person they've been waiting for finally walks through the door. Jason sat on the floor with Burke for a few minutes, which was their standard reunion protocol, and then made dinner and watched 30 minutes of a documentary about rivers and went to bed. He did not check his phone. He did not know yet that a journalist from a national magazine had already filed a request for an interview. He did not know that a documentary production company had emailed his firm asking whether he would be open to a longer conversation. He did not know that a veterans organization in Texas had started a fundraising campaign in his name, unauthorized, well-intentioned, quickly growing, to support PTSD treatment programs, using his image and the words "nothing" in him was running. He did not know about any of it. Burke slept on the end of the bed, and the apartment was quiet, and outside the Virginia Beach night was doing what Virginia Beach nights do, slow, warm, smelling of salt and distance. And Jason Cole slept the way he had learned to sleep in places where sleep was a resource to be managed, which was completely and without drama. The world outside was very loud. He was, as he had always been, very quiet. These two things were not in conflict. They were just not the same thing, and they had never needed to be, and that more than the kneeling, more than the dogs, more than the 11 seconds that 11 million people had watched and rewatched and shared and named, that was the story. That was always the story. The question it asked was not, what did he do? The question was, what does a person have to become over the long and ordinary and grinding years to be capable of doing it without knowing it was extraordinary? Nobody had answered that question yet. They were still trying to find him to ask. 3 weeks after the video went everywhere, a letter arrived at Jason Cole's apartment. Not an email, not a media request forwarded through his firm's front desk. An actual letter, handwritten on plain white paper, folded twice, in an envelope with a return address from a town in rural Georgia that Jason had never heard of. He opened it at his kitchen table on a Wednesday morning while Burke sat on his feet, which was Burke's preferred location on cold mornings. The letter was from a woman named Carol Dent. She was 61 years old. Her son, a Marine named Patrick Dent, had come home from 2 tours in Helmand Province and had spent 4 years fighting a war that lived behind his eyes and had no front line and no clear objective and no visible end. He had, in Carol's words, become a person she could see but could not reach, present in the room, absent from everything else, circling something she did not have the language for and that he did not have the words to name. She had watched the video. She had watched it because her neighbor sent it to her, and she watched things her neighbor sent to her because her neighbor was reliable about these things. She had watched it 3 times. Then she had printed a still from it, the frame where Jason was kneeling, arms out, the 4 dogs closing in, and she had put it on the kitchen table and left it there overnight. And in the morning she had come downstairs, and her son was sitting at the table looking at the picture, and for the first time in 4 years he had cried. Not dramatically, not the way movies show it. He had cried the way men cry who have been holding something so long that when it finally moves, it moves like a slow river, not a flood. She did not ask him about it. She made coffee. They sat at the table together for 2 hours, and she did not ask a single question, and he did not explain anything, and by the end of it something had shifted in the room that she couldn't measure but could absolutely feel. She had written to Jason because she wanted him to know that. She did not ask for anything. She was not requesting a response. She simply felt, with the particular certainty of a mother who has been watching her child disappear 1 degree at a time, that the man in the picture deserved to know what his 11 seconds had done at a kitchen table in rural Georgia. Jason read the letter twice. He put it on his desk. He went for a run. This is what he did when something needed to be held for a while before he knew what to do with it. He ran and let his body process what his mind was not ready to organize. for miles through the neighborhood, past the 7-Eleven where the same man was always sitting outside with coffee at 7 in the morning, past the elementary school where the crossing guard waved at him every day as though they were old friends, which by now they essentially were, past the small park where Burke pulled hard left every morning, and they were headed in a different direction, so it was never going to happen. Burke, we're not going to the park. He ran. He thought about Patrick Dent at a kitchen table. He thought about the picture his mother had printed, a frame from 11 seconds of phone footage, overexposed, slightly blurry, and what it had done to a man who had been unreachable for 4 years. He had not knelt on that field for Patrick Dent. He had not knelt for anyone. He had knelt because it was the most mechanically effective way to remove himself as a threat stimulus from the perceptual field of 4 trained dogs, and because Briggs was standing 20 yards behind him without protective equipment, and the math was very clear. But he ran 4 miles and thought about what Carol Dent had written, and when he came back to the apartment, sweating and quiet, he sat down and wrote her back. The letter he wrote was not long. It was not eloquent in the way that letters and stories are eloquent. It was Jason Cole writing the way Jason Cole communicated, directly, without decoration, with the slightly compressed grammar of a man who communicates mostly through action and finds words to be a less efficient system. He thanked her for writing. He said he was glad the picture had done something for Patrick. He said that in his experience, and he did not elaborate on what his experience consisted of, because Carol Dent did not need a resume. She needed a human being. The things that reach people who have come back from hard places are rarely the things that are designed to reach them. They are almost always accidental. A song, a morning, an image on a kitchen table that they did not ask for and cannot fully explain. He said he hoped Patrick found his way to whatever came next. He signed it with his first name only. He mailed it from the post office around the corner, which had a clerk named Dennis who always tried to upsell him on priority shipping, and Jason always declined, and Dennis always acted surprised, and this had been their ritual for 2 years, and neither of them showed any sign of ending it. He did not know that Carol Dent would keep that letter in the same envelope for the next decade. He did not know that she would show it to Patrick, and that Patrick would read it at the same kitchen table where he had cried over the picture, and that Patrick would eventually use it. Not the letter itself, but something it unlocked as the first step toward calling a veterans counseling line he had had programmed into his phone for 8 months without dialing. He did not know any of that. He went home and fed Burke and answered 3 work emails and made a grocery list. The world was still loud. It got louder before it got quieter. A production company reached him through his firm's official channel in the 4th week, and he had the conversation he had been avoiding, which lasted 11 minutes and ended with him saying clearly and without hostility that he appreciated the interest and was not available. The journalist from the national magazine left a message that was genuinely well-crafted. He noticed this, the way you notice when something is done well, separate from whether you want it, and he did not return it. A public speaking bureau sent a proposal through his firm that included a compensation figure that made his supervisor inhale audibly when she read it to him over the phone. He said he'd think about it. He did not think about it. What he was actually thinking about, in the weeks that the noise was at its highest, was a conversation he had had 2 years earlier with a man named Reyes, a former Army Ranger who had been through his own grinding passage back from service and had come out the other side working with a nonprofit that ran outdoor leadership programs for veterans struggling with the transition. Reyes had said something that had stayed with Jason in the way that things said simply and without performance tend to stay. That the hardest part of coming home was not the darkness, which was expected and named and had organizations devoted to it. It was the loss of purpose. The loss of the sensation that what you do today is genuinely, concretely, with measurable consequence, necessary. That the thing that saved him, Reyes had said, was finding the work again. Not war work, just work, real work. The thing you are actually built for, applied where it is actually needed. Jason had been carrying this for 2 years, and the Carol Dent letter and the Patrick Dent kitchen table and the 11-second video that had traveled to places he would never go and done things he would never see all of it was adding up to something that he was circling in the way that he ran the long way to let things become clear. He called Reyes in early April. They talked for an hour, which was unusually long for Jason, whose phone calls tended toward utility and brevity. He asked about the program, about what it looked like in practice, about what the veterans who came through it actually needed, not in the brochure language, but in the specific and physical reality of a Tuesday morning when a person who has been carrying something too heavy for too long walks through a door and needs to find out what solid ground feels like. Reyes talked. Jason listened. He asked about funding, about structure, about what was missing. He was quiet for a while. Then he said he might want to get involved. Reyes, who had known Jason for several years and was familiar with the economy of what it meant when Jason said he might want to do something, said that was the best thing he had heard in a while. What happened over the following months was not a dramatic transformation. It was not the kind of story that has a clean arc and a moment where everything changes and a lesson is announced. It was the kind of story that actually happens, which is incremental and sometimes backward and full of the logistical mundanity of doing real things in the real world. He started as a volunteer, 2 Saturdays a month, driving out to a facility in the rural outskirts of Virginia Beach where Reyes' organization ran 5-day outdoor programs for post-9/11 veterans. He led navigation sessions. He ran rope work with people who had done rope work before in contexts where the stakes were very different. He sat around fires in the evenings with men and women who had come back from places similar to the places he had been, and he was quiet in the way that he was always quiet, and he did not give speeches, and he did not perform the role of the person in the viral video. He was just a guy who knew some things, who had been in some places, who could sit with people who needed someone to sit with them without filling the silence with words that wouldn't help. It turned out that this was, for the particular population of people in those programs, an extremely specific and useful thing to be. Veterans who have been through selection and deployment and the particular grind of high-stakes service develop, among other things, a very precise bullshit detector. They can read performed empathy and genuine presence from 200 yards in bad light, and they respond to them accordingly, which is to say that performed empathy produces walls and genuine presence produces the slow, careful opening of something that has been closed for a long time. Jason Cole did not have performed empathy. He was not, by his own self-assessment, a particularly empathetic person in the way that word is usually used. He was not warm in the conventional sense. He did not have the easy softness that therapists develop, the cushioning language, the reflective questions. He had something different. He had the quality that Briggs had named clumsily and exactly in a too big television studio chair 3 weeks after the demonstration. That settled thing. The quality of a person in whom nothing is running. And it turned out that for people who had spent years running from something they couldn't name and couldn't stop and couldn't see clearly, being in proximity to a person who was not running was in ways that none of them could fully articulate. But all of them clearly felt something close to medicine. He became a regular presence at the program. Then, a more than regular presence. Then, Reyes asked him to come on in a formal capacity, part-time to start, which turned into the kind of part-time that is actually full-time by any honest measure of hours and investment, and Jason adjusted his contracting work to accommodate it. And his supervisor raised an eyebrow, and he told her what he was doing, and she was quiet for a moment, and then said, in the tone of someone recalibrating an assessment they thought was already complete, "Yeah, that makes sense." There were hard days. There were people who came through the program carrying things so heavy and so long held that 5 days in the outdoors with a quiet man who knew rope work was not going to move them far enough. There were days where Jason drove home with the particular exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from sitting with other people's pain long enough that it becomes temporarily indistinguishable from your own. There were days he called Reyes at 10 at night to talk through something that hadn't resolved by the time he reached his driveway, and Reyes, who had been through similar territory, talked him through it with the patience of someone who has been the person needing the call and understands exactly what it costs to make one. Burke was always at the end of the bed. Some things remain constant. The video never fully disappeared. It resurfaced every few months, some anniversary, some news cycle, some algorithm deciding it was time again. And each time it found a new set of eyes and produced a new set of reactions and traveled to places it had never been. It was shown in police training seminars in 3 states. It was shown in a veterans advocacy conference in Washington, D.C. as part of a presentation on the gap between civilian perception of military experience and the actual embodied knowledge that service produces. A psychology professor at the University of Michigan used it in a lecture on the neuroscience of fear response modulation. Jason heard about most of this secondhand. He found a psychology lecture citation mildly interesting. He found the rest of it to be the sound of a world processing something he had already put down and moved past, which was fine, which was what worlds did, which did not require his participation. Patrick Dent eventually called the counseling line. He went through 14 months of treatment. He got to a place that his mother described in a note she sent to Jason 2 years after her first letter as not finished, but walking forward again. She included a photograph. Not the viral frame, but a picture she had taken herself with her phone slightly off-center of Patrick standing in her backyard in the morning light with a cup of coffee, looking at nothing in particular. He looked like a person standing in a backyard, which was, she wrote everything. Jason kept that photograph on his desk, not as a monument to something he had done. He had not done what that photograph represented. Patrick Dent had done it, and Carol Dent had done it, and the counselors and the early mornings and the hard work of deciding that life still had structure worth returning to had done it. Jason had knelt in a field for 11 seconds and mailed a short letter from a post office where a man named Dennis always tried to sell him priority shipping. He kept the photograph because it reminded him of something that his training had taught him about objectives, which is that the objective is rarely what it looks like at the beginning, and the outcome is almost never the one that was on the briefing sheet. And the work is the work regardless of what you were told the work was before you started. He kept it because it was a picture of a person walking forward, which was, in his estimation, the only direction that mattered. The 4 German shepherds from the demonstration were reassigned to routine patrol duties. Briggs went on to pass his K-9 handling certification 6 months later and was assigned to the same unit. Lieutenant Harmon quietly overhauled his demonstration protocols and never held another public showcase using multi-dog pursuit simulation without triple redundant volunteer confirmation and full gear check. These were small changes. They were the real ones. And somewhere in Virginia Beach, on any given Tuesday, a man who went to war 4 times and came home quietly and opened a gate with a pen and knelt in the dirt without flinching. That man was driving to a facility on the rural outskirts of town in a truck with a dog in the back seat who was pressed against the window enjoying the wind. And he was going to spend the day doing work that did not look like anything from the outside. Work that did not have a video. That was not 11 seconds. That was just one day and then another after that. The only kind that counts.